Over the years, the way that we have talked to machines has changed. There are many concepts, many languages, many paradigms, many different ways to skin a cat. You have programming languages, scripting languages, markup languages, and query languages. It's very rare to find an app that ever uses one of these, because if it does, it's a very small, useless app that's probably not in the public domain. So that begs the question, how does a computer know what we're talking about? Well, it has a compiler. In my case, the one that I use is called Roslyn, which is developed by Microsoft for the C# language. But it goes deeper than that. They are literally languages. They're different in the way that they're written and the way that they're understood. That's why what happens is very clever. First thing we need to answer, what's a compiler? To write code, you need to make use of what's known as an IDE, or an integrated development environment. This is essentially a really fancy text editor. People have probably heard of Notepad, which is a very basic and high-level application on Windows. That technically can be used as an IDE. Now, not in its current form that you might have installed. You can use Notepad++, which is an open source software. Open source means that anyone has access to edit it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their changes will go live, because they have to submit what's known as a pull request, which basically means that trusted people can check the code that's been written to make sure it's not going to break anything and it does in fact achieve the desired effects. Within your IDE of choice, you'll find many things, but most importantly, two things: the compiler and the programming languages. You can't have an app without either of these two things, obviously. I mean, you have to have some way of translating and reading the code that you are supposed to write so it knows what to do with it. But you also have to have the code to write in the first place. And that's the tricky bit. Most applications these days use more than one programming language, and often you can think of a website as using many of these. A website's a good analogy to use. Most people will be familiar with HTML in some form, and I hate to break it to you, if you know how to write HTML, you're not really a programmer. That's not a programming language. That's known as markup, because you're marking up the code that you need to write. It's clever. It's really clever, and also to some degree holds your hand. The thing about HTML, or hypertext markup language, is that when you write the code, what you're doing is utilizing a tag. You will have code written within tags, as in, if you have a title, you'll need a title tag. But these days, it goes beyond just regular markup languages. You will use a scripting language. You'll have a database on the back end, which requires use of SQL or some other form of query language, and probably some sort of general purpose programming language like C#. But the question is, how does a computer know how to use all these languages together? Now, my experience in programming is vastly in C#. I've done bits here and there in Java and Visual Basic. C# is kind of my baby, really. That's what I was trained in. That's what I've used for the past 4 or 5 years. I was trained when I was an apprentice on C#. That was our main sort of language that we would use for any programming purposes. C# and Visual Basic both belong to what is known as the .NET family, or framework, or core, as framework is now being retired. The .NET Core is Microsoft's technology stack. They use .NET in everything they do. They are the key proponents of it. They create it, they write it. They have a massive team working on it at all times to improve the language continuously and keep it up to speed with other developments within the field. But Visual Basic, which is an older language than C#, it hasn't gone away. But it's still, people still use it. Too many people, in my opinion. A lot of banks and sort of legacy software providers still use quite a lot of Visual Basic across their projects. But the compiler still needs to know how to use Visual Basic and C# together. This is done really cleverly by what's known as an intermediary language. Now, an intermediary language is universal. The computer will know your IL, and it will know how to translate this from pretty much any language you can use. Because if it didn't, it'd be completely pointless. The reason why this has to happen is because there's levels to code and programming in general. So you have the high level, which is human readable, all the way down to the basic binary. Now, when you build or run your application from your IDE, the compiler will scan the code to make sure that there is nothing there that could break it. and it will continue to do so for the whole lifetime of the application. Now, for the purposes of this, the lifetime is from on to off. From the second it's turned on to the second that it's killed. The process has stopped and there's no more danger. This is because, obviously, we've all experienced it during the life cycle of an application. It can crash and the compiler crashes it for you. But that's a story for another day. But the leveling system is what's important in the compiler's life, really, because to understand if there's an error or a bug or anything to do with that code, how to even interpret it and do the things it's being asked to do, it has to have the ability to convert your high-level code to your IL. And your IL is understood by the computer and it's run. Now, I'm going to show you two code snippets now. They achieve the same thing, but they look quite different. We're going to have C# and Visual Basic both running a simple calculator program, and we'll see how differently it's done and how the compiler just knows how to produce the exact same input. So these are just two snippets of code that I've created just for demonstrative purposes. You've got the C# code, which is doing, as you can see here, it's just a simple addition program. You have one input where you can put in your first value, then it will tell you to put in a second value, and then when you do the second value, it will add them up and print out the result. And you can see how the VB code does the same thing in a much different way. Now, these two code snippets are so different to each other, which means the use of the intermediary language is necessary. This basically is middleman. It is the Google Translate of the coding world, and it will take these two pieces of code, turn them into one universal piece of code that will allow the computer to produce one singular output that is exactly the same across both snippets. And that's what you're seeing now. But hopefully this video has been a bit more structured than the last one, and it's been just as educational and informative, because that is the point. These things interest me, so hopefully I'm able to share this knowledge around. And any tips and advice about how to improve in the future would be very much appreciated. If anyone has any ideas of things that I can talk about, please do also let me know.